2023 has been a fantastic year for gaming. We saw an open world Harry Potter game with Hogwarts Legacy, an emotional return to the Jedi series with Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and a surprise hit with Hi-Fi Rush. Gamers were also given two of the most highly anticipated games in recent years with Bethesda Game Studios' Starfield and Nintendo's Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. JRPGs and Square Enix also had excellent showings with Octopath Traveler 2 and Final Fantasy XVI. We also can't forget the immensely successful Baldur's Gate 3 and how it brought a much-needed fresh take to the RPG genre. Furthermore, I personally got two of my most anticipated games of the year with Resident Evil 4 Remake and Marvel Spider-Man 2. Gamers received banger after banger after banger that it almost seemed impossible to find time to play all these games, let alone trying to decide which game was the most deserving of the coveted Game of the Year title. Then came along Alan Wake 2. Alan Wake 2 is Remedy's latest entry into their weird library of supernatural horror games, and like many other games that have come out this year, it has been met with pretty much universal acclaim. Gaming media outlets and gamers alike all praised the game and hailed it as a true current-gen experience, with some people calling it the true game of the generation. However, with statements like these, I immediately become skeptical. They're bold statements, especially with so many other fire games that have come out in 2023 and so much of the generation left. I can't help but question if the game is truly as good as people were making it out to be. So I decided to see what was up for myself. Originally, I had no plans to play Alan Wake 2 for a couple of reasons. The first reason being that I had never played Alan Wake 1. And the second reason being that I don't like the idea of digital-only games. It just doesn't feel like I own these games, and that they could be taken away from us at any moment. So typically, I don't like to support that kind of practice, but that's a topic for another video. With all that being said, and after many discussions with my friends, I decided that I truly had no say on the matter of whether or not the game was worth being called Game of the Year until I had played Alan Wake 2 for myself. Furthermore, I've had my fingers in all the pies of most of the other Game of the Year contenders, even if I haven't completed them all. So why not add this one to the mix so I can at least have a legit say in the discussion? So I went ahead and purchased Alan Wake and Alan Wake 2 for research purposes. I'm not going to just play these games. I'm also going to replay Control and play its DLC so I have full story context of Remedy's connected universe. In this video, I'll take you through my experiences and the thoughts that I had while playing these games as a means to review all of them at once, and to see if Alan Wake 2 is truly as good as people are saying it is, and if I believe that it is truly a 2023 Game of the Year contender. So this is going to be kind of a weird video. Hello everyone, my name is Brent, and this is my review of the Remedy Connected Universe games and my thoughts on where Alan Wake 2 fits into the 2023 Game of the Year discussion. This is a spoiler warning for Alan Wake and Control. I'll remain spoiler-free for Alan Wake 2. I began playing Alan Wake, and after an hour or so of tutorials and intro cutscenes, the game started to get going, and I was immediately intrigued by the story and the gameplay mechanics. The story sees Alan Wake, a popular author, on vacation with his wife Alice in a town called Bright Falls. Not long after arriving at the cabin that they'll be staying at on Cauldron Lake, a mysterious dark presence takes Alice. Alan wakes up after a car accident and realizes a week's worth of time has been lost and begins to search for Alice. As he searches for her, Alan encounters enemies called Taken, people who have been corrupted by the dark presence, that only become vulnerable after exposing them to enough light. Over the course of the game, new mysteries emerge, such as what the Dark Presence is and how to get rid of it. It is revealed that within Cauldron Lake, there is another dimension known as the Dark Place. This is where the Dark Presence resides, and it uses art as a means to escape by turning said art into reality. It tried this once before with an author by the name of Thomas Zane, and again with Alan Wake. At the end of the main game, Alan is able to rescue Alice from the Dark Place, but in turn gets trapped there himself. I really like the gameplay in Alan Wake. Don't get me wrong, there are certain aspects of the gameplay that felt dated, considering the game was first released in 2010. There were aspects of the driving mechanics that didn't quite feel right, and although the flashlight could be viewed as a crosshair, the lack of a true crosshair felt weird. However, after a while, I did get used to these things. Also, I'm used to using the left trigger as a means to aim down sights, so it took some getting used to the fact that Alan Wake doesn't really have an aim down sights mechanic. Instead, the left trigger is used to amplify the effects of your flashlight. On the topic of the flashlight, I really like the mechanic of having to use light as a means to defeat enemies. It brought a fresh feel to the combat of the game. If you didn't have enough means to generate light, then defeating enemies was next to impossible. I also really liked how the game provided you with different ways to create light, such as using a flare gun, handheld flares, and flashbang grenades as means to defeat the Taken. After I completed the main story for Alan Wake, I moved on to the DLC episodes of the game. The first episode is called The Signal, where we find Alan Wake trapped in the dark place, and with the help of Thomas Zane, Alan begins to navigate through it. The first DLC was significantly harder than the base game. It came as a bit of a surprise, but it was also appreciated because I felt like the base game was rather easy. Although I like The Signal, I can't say the same about the second DLC called The Rider. The second DLC finds Alan working his way to a lighthouse, and Alan has to do a bunch of platforming. I gotta say, I fucking hate platforming. And not only do I hate platforming, but I fucking hate platforming with dated platforming mechanics. Then we move on to this Ferris wheel maze thing that Alan has to navigate. Anyways, long story short, I stopped playing at this point and deleted the game from my console. That Ferris wheel maze thing was some bullshit, so I watched the rest of the DLC on YouTube. This isn't bad game design per se, this is just me being terrible at platforming. To wrap up my thoughts on Alan Wake, I really enjoyed this game, just not all of the DLC. I love the simplicity of it. It's a straightforward psychological action horror game without a ton of unneeded bells and whistles. It reminded me of a time when simplicity in gaming was appreciated. Nowadays, it feels like most AAA games throw a bunch of supernormal stimuli at you to overload your senses. Don't get me wrong, I do love a good modern AAA title, but most of the time after completing one, I feel like I'm exhausted from everything that was just thrown at me by the game. I never got this feeling from Alan Wake, which made playing the game feel like I was playing a game rather than running some weird gaming session marathon. With Alan Wake and its DLC done, it was time to move on to Control. So, I've played Control before. I played it when it first came out in 2019, and it was one of my favorite games to come out that year. The game initially drew my attention because it reminded me of one of my favorite PS2 titles, PsyOps: The Mindgate Conspiracy. By the way, if you've heard of PsyOps, please leave a comment on this video. I want to know how many people have actually heard of that game. Anyways, I love games that make you feel powerful, and I love games where you have psychic powers, so Control was definitely going to be right up my alley. I remember not being able to put Control down until I got the Platinum Trophy, and while I was playing the game at the time, I had no idea that it was part of the same universe as Alan Wake. Fast forward to now. When I started playing Control again, I made sure to pay attention to the story itself and every little collectible that I found so I could see the connections between the two games. The story of Control is simple and complex at the same time, so I'll do my best to describe it. Control takes place inside of the Federal Bureau of Control, or FBC, a government agency that is tasked with studying altered world events, or AWEs, which are events that center around some sort of supernatural occurrence and objects of power, which are items that can be created from AWEs and usually hold some sort of supernatural power. The FBC is inside an object of power itself, known as the Oldest House, which is connected to many dimensions, including the astral plane, where a black pyramid known as the Board resides, with the Board dictating who the director of the FBC is through the use of the service weapon, which is also an object of power. This leads us to the main character of the game, Jessie Faden, who is looking for her brother Dylan, who was taken by the FBC after an altered world event in their hometown. After 17 years of searching, Jessie finds herself inside the Oldest House during a lockdown and is chosen by the service weapon to be the FBC's new director. She soon realizes that an entity known as the Hiss has taken over most of the members of the FBC, and in order to find her brother, she must stop the threat by gaining powers from objects of power that have been spread around the Oldest House through the use of Polaris, an entity that has latched itself onto Jessie after the altered world event in her hometown. Okay, I did my best with all of that, and perhaps it's not all that simple, but that's the gist of the story. Control has deep lore that you can learn through watching various videos that are spread throughout the Oldest House and the various collectibles that you can find as well. At first, you can only find documents that reference the events of Alan Wake, such as interviews with Alan Wake's wife, documents that describe the thermoses that you find in Alan Wake as objects of power, and a case summary of Bright Falls. It isn't until you get to Control's second DLC called Altered World Events that you really get to see how connected Control is to Alan Wake. During the events of the Altered World Events DLC, Jessie is summoned to the abandoned investigations department by an apparition of Alan Wake, who is still stuck inside the dark place. Upon entry to the department, Jessie soon discovers the reason why it was abandoned in the first place. Dr. Emil Hartman, a character from Alan Wake who has been infected by the Dark Presence, escaped and was destroying the sector, therefore the FBC had to abandon and seal it off. Jesse must now track down and destroy Dr. Hartman, who is not only infected by the Dark Presence, but by the Hiss as well. Jesse finds Hartman, defeats him, and reopens the investigations department, with the final moments of the DLC hinting at the events to come in Alan Wake 2.
Something on my terminal here, an AWE alert from Bright Falls, Washington? But it might be a glitch. The date's all wrong, a couple of years in the future. And we're in lockdown, there shouldn't be any incoming signals.
Maybe it was active before we went into lockdown? Are there agents on site?
Let me check.
I really love Control. It's one of my favorite games in recent years. It was, and still is, a bit clunky at times, with massive sputtering happening when you unpause the game. But that doesn't distract from my overall experience while playing the game. As I said earlier, I love games that make you feel powerful, and Control does absolutely that with its variety of powers. There are some things that I feel could have been dialed back a bit, and that's the weapon and personal mod stuff. I feel like there could have been less of them or none of them at all, but that's just me. The base game for Control offers a wide variety of activities to do between story missions such as fighting weird bosses, fighting off certain types of enemies with certain guns or powers, and side missions that are given to you by the various characters that you meet along the way. The Foundation DLC is also pretty cool. It's definitely tied more to the lore of Control rather than Alan Wake, and the events of that DLC are most likely to affect the events of Control too. And of course, we have Altered World events. I really like this DLC as well and how it connected and brought the universes of the two games together. And I got to learn more about the events in Bright Falls as well. Speaking of Bright Falls, we're now at the main event of this video, Alan Wake 2. Okay, so where to begin with this? There's a lot to unpack here, and I want to be careful not to accidentally spoil anything. And if I do end up saying something that you might consider to be a spoiler, just know it wasn't my intention. I should start by saying that I feel like it is critical to have played Control prior to playing Alan Wake 2. I've seen other franchises be loosely connected to each other by some means or another, but not to the extent that you have to play those other franchises in order to understand what is going on in another franchise. That is definitely not the case with Alan Wake 2. The Remedy connected universe is just that. It's all connected, and it's all connected back to the first Alan Wake game. So going into Alan Wake 2, you better at least be familiar with the events of Control. Let's get into what I can tell you about the story. Alan Wake 2 takes place 13 years after the events of Alan Wake and about 5 years or so after the events of Control. The game starts you off as Saga Anderson, a special agent with the FBI who's been sent to Bright Falls and Cauldron Lake to investigate a series of ritualistic murders that have taken place there. She is also accompanied by her partner Alex Casey. As the two of them begin to investigate the murders, they start to see a pattern that all leads back to Alan Wake's disappearance from Bright Falls 13 years prior. The plot continues to thicken when Alan Wake himself makes a sudden return to the shores of Cauldron Lake. That's really all I can say about it without going too deep into spoilers.
Where did you come from? You've been missing for 13 years.
13.
I really liked how this game tells its story. You start by playing as Saga Anderson investigating the murders in Bright Falls, and after a few chapters, you are given the ability to switch to Alan Wake as he navigates the dark place in an attempt to escape it. And so long as you are in the right save rooms, you can switch between the two characters as you please. Being able to play as a certain character when you want to makes certain parts of the story feel really unique depending on which character you're playing as at any given time. For example, I played most of the game as Saga Anderson before switching to play as Alan Wake. Once I started playing more of Alan Wake's side of the story, my mind would continuously get blown because as the player, I would suddenly have more information or context than the other character that I wasn't playing as. The next time I play Alan Wake 2, I plan to play more of Alan Wake's side of the story to start, rather than Saga to see how that feels. Because of all of this, Alan Wake 2 provided me with more oh shit moments than any other game that I've played in recent history. The last thing I want to touch on in regards to the story is Saga Anderson's mind place and the mystery board within it. I've seen some complaints online about this aspect of the story and gameplay and how it can disrupt the flow of the game at times. I understand these concerns because in the beginning, it certainly felt that way to me. However, after a while, I found it to be a really great resource to remind me of certain events within the game because a lot of stuff happens in Alan Wake 2. And it was nice to be able to visit the mystery board to get a refresher on certain events and details. Furthermore, the Mind Place becomes an integral part of the narrative, and visiting it felt like it was just part of the story rather than this weird thing that interrupts the pacing. As for Alan Wake's equivalent to the Mind Place, that's something that you'll have to experience for yourself. It's really cool, and I don't want to give anything away. Unlike the first Alan Wake game, Alan Wake 2 is a survival horror game rather than an action horror game. The game plays similarly to most modern Resident Evil games with a third-person over-the-shoulder perspective. You also have a limited amount of inventory space on your person while having a rather large storage container in the save rooms where you can store all of your extra stuff. You can also set your items to a quick access bar that you can use via the D-pad. I really liked how enemy encounters are tough but fair. I also really liked the fact that the flashlight doesn't recharge in Alan Wake 2 like it did in Alan Wake. This meant that every time you went to break an enemy's darkness shield, it needed to be worth it. However, on the flip side of that, I am disappointed that in Alan Wake 2, you no longer have the ability to simply shine your flashlight on an enemy and have it slowly damage their shield without using a charge. In the first Alan Wake game, this is something that you could do. Now, in Alan Wake 2, if you want to break an enemy's darkness shield, you have to either use a flashlight charge or flares on said enemy. I understand that having that gameplay mechanic could have taken away from the survivor horror element of the game. But if you could slowly chip away at a shield without using a charge, at least you wouldn't be SOL if you ran out of battery charges. And not to sound like I'm going in circles with this, what ultimately made not having this ability okay was the fact that item placement was fair, and that usually meant that you'd be okay with whatever supplies you needed, including batteries. However, the game was really, really good at making you believe that you might run out of batteries, or any other supplies for that matter. That was a weird tangent. Anyways, moving on. The combat in Alan Wake 2 feels slow and heavy. I mean that in a good way though, because it also makes everything feel more precise. This is probably the wrong way to describe it. Basically, the combat in Alan Wake 2 encourages you to be meticulous in how you handle any given enemy encounter, especially the boss fights. Enemies hit really hard, and you can sometimes get overwhelmed and killed if you're not ready or careful and precise with your shot placement. Furthermore, some enemies are bullet sponges, and before you know it, you could be out of ammo after just 2 or 3 enemies. I often found myself thinking about enemy encounters that may or may not happen 5, 10, 15, 30 minutes down the line from whatever it was that I was doing. In other survival horror games like Resident Evil, I always felt like I had an overabundance of supplies, so I never felt like I would be concerned about what was going to happen around the corner while playing those games. However, in Alan Wake 2, supplies didn't always feel abundant, except for crossbow arrows. I always felt like I had plenty of crossbow arrows. I know I said this before, that item placement was fair. However, the realization didn't really come to me until after I completed the game and started writing this review. So while actually playing the game, there were several occasions where I thought I was fucked. The last thing I really want to touch on is Alan Wake 2's use of live action cutscenes. Although you see some minimal use of live action in Alan Wake, Remedy didn't really lean into it as part of their storytelling within the connected universe until Control. At the time, I thought they were nothing more than an artistic choice. Perhaps they were just that when Control was being made, but more and more I realized, and especially in the case of Alan Wake 2, they are essential to Remedy's storytelling. Video games have certainly come a long way with capturing an actor's facial expressions with the use of the many different motion capture techniques. However, certain subtleties and nuances in one's facial expressions can't always be captured with these techniques. During the live-action cutscenes in Alan Wake 2, you are really able to see the confusion and the psychological toll that the Dark Place is taking on Alan Wake through the expressions that you are only able to get through live-action acting. Furthermore, these live-action scenes add an additional unnerving effect to an already unnerving game and story. Let's go ahead and wrap up the review portion of this video so we can talk about how Alan Wake 2 fits into the Game of the Year discussion. So, what did I think of Alan Wake 2? Well, I absolutely loved it. One of the things that I've enjoyed with all of the Remedy Connected Universe games is that all of the games have been very simplistic in their gameplay experience. Remedy set out to make a true survival horror game with Alan Wake 2, and in every way, they succeeded, and without being over the top with flash either. Don't get me wrong, the game can be very flashy at times, but it does so in tasteful ways that can hardly be noticed. Alan Wake 2 has set a new standard for what a narrative-driven survival horror game should aspire to be, in both how the narrative is told and how it plays. Alan Wake 2 is brilliant in how it leaves you guessing after every story beat and how it gaslights you into believing certain things. Furthermore, the mind place and how it uses the mystery board and the profiling of characters to tell parts of the story is also brilliant. Is Alan Wake 2 the game of the generation? I don't know. There's still plenty of generation left, so who's to say? However, I do believe that it is a generation-defining game. This was the first game where I actually felt like I was playing a game that is truly meant for this generation. Look, I love God of War Ragnarok and I love Horizon Forbidden West, but both of those games can be played on the PS4, and I'm sure if Insomniac really tried, they could probably get Spider-Man 2 running on the PS4 as well. And I'm sorry, Xbox fans, come at me all you want, but Starfield just isn't quite there yet, both visually and its performance to feel like a current generation experience. And as far as Nintendo goes, both Super Mario Bros. Wonder and The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom are technically both part of the previous generation. I had yet to have my mind blown by a true current gen experience until playing Alan Wake 2 came along. This is why I feel like Alan Wake 2 is the clear choice for 2023's Game of the Year. I know I have yet to mention Baldur's Gate 3, and the game deserves all the praise that it's getting, but Alan Wake 2 is truly something special that is the culmination of Remedy's unique way of telling stories through video games. Anyways, let's wrap this up. I really enjoyed my time playing Alan Wake 2. Shit, I really enjoyed my time playing all of these Remedy games for the past 3 or 4 weeks, or however long it's been. There's something truly special about playing several games that are all associated with a single story in succession. Like I said, initially I had no plans to buy Alan Wake 2 since it's only available as a digital purchase. That's a practice I don't want to support. I bought the game as a means for making content, and I ended up loving the game in the process. And if Remedy ever decides to release a physical version of the game, I plan on rebuying it because I want to support physical media for as long as I am able to. Anyway, I don't want to drag this outro out. I feel like I've said my piece throughout this video. Before I do go, I just want to say, you know who you are, and shut up. I'll let you have this win. All right, I gotta go. If you like this video and you want to see more like it, please subscribe. Until the next video, take care.